I don't know how we can do an effective genealogy if we don't understand the history of the region, migration patterns, the customs of what were prevalent during a specific time period. Today, this presentation, I have always been interested in the land grants in New Mexico. Many of us, or all of us, have roots in New Mexico, whether they go back to the late 1800s, middle 1800s, early 1800s, 1700s, or during the pre-revolt period, that would be between 1598 and 1680. But I'm going to concentrate on Taos County. And Taos County, as it appeared in the 1850 census, because that was the first U.S. census in New Mexico during the American occupation. And I will use that phrase a lot because it was an occupation, and without getting into a lot of history about it, as the American government came in and just took over the territory of New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Texas had already been taken over by the Tejanos in the 1830s. Okay, how many of you have ancestors that go back to San Luis, Costilla, Arroyo Hondo, Cerro, Questa, and you know that Questa previously was called El Rio Colorado because the Red River that comes through there. And initially, and you're going to find in your packet, was El San Antonio del Rio Colorado. How many of you have roots in Taos? How many of you have roots in Mora? How many of you have roots in the Rio Arribe area, especially around Ojo Caliente and Embudo, and Dixon, right? So we all have connections in that area. So that prompted me to do further research in this, and as many of you know, and it's not an excuse and it's not a reason, but as an educator and a researcher, I've always loved to get into the library and do some work. And when I started this project and I told my wife, here's my outline, and this is what I would like to cover and help our genealogy group maybe understand a little bit about where their ancestors were at a particular time frame in New Mexico. So as I got into this in October and then November and then December, she would ask me, "Are you done yet?" And I said, "No, I can't finish. There's just so much to cover." So with that, I'd like to kind of walk you through the packet of information. And I first would like to thank Penny and the board for assuming the costs of the print of the packet of information that I've given you. So what you will have in front of you is, I divided this project into about 5 parts. I wanted to give you a basic framework understanding of land ownership, land grants in New Mexico, particularly from the post-revolt. And the post-revolt is when Vargas came in 1692 into New Mexico. And how the whole application rules that he set up with the Viceroy of Nueva España, which was then Mexico, which is now Mexico, how those rules were set up, the purpose behind those rules, and the purpose behind the land grants. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that. Then the next part in your booklet, and I had it divided by color sheets. So the next part of your booklet is going to be a glossary of terms. You may hear some of those terms in my presentation, and you may not. But I included them because if you decide to do some research on your own, you're going to run into a lot of these words, including those works that have been translated from Spanish to English. So I wanted to give you familiarity with regards to a vocabulary. Okay, thank you, Ruthie. What I want to do is, because I only printed 30 packets, and we used Penny and I used just a number of 30, not knowing exactly how many people were going to be here. At the end of the meeting or my presentation, if you did not get a packet and would like one, why don't you write your name on the tablet? Also, I have a second tablet, and I will label them as after my presentation, because the body of my work is not included in your packet. That was 30 pages long. And even though we decided that we were going to do front and back, it still was going to run into a little bit of money. If you want the body of that work, and which includes a lot of footnotes and sources that I acquired, that body is a summary of each of the land grants. And I did them in alphabetical order, not in chronological order. So the first land grant that you're going to see is Arroyo Hondo. So what I did with each of the land grants is I looked at a lot of research, including summaries that I would like to meet this guy. His name is J.J. Bowden. For his master's thesis out of SMU in the early 70s, he was at the archives in Santa Fe, and he read the primary source, the Spanish works of each of the land grants, and he translated them into English, and then he summarized them. So I took parts of that and gave him credit, of course, as well as other writers who had information on each of the land grants in Taos County. So that part I did not include because, like I said, it's 30 pages long. If you would like a copy of that, I want you to fill it out on the other tablet. And if you want it by way of email, include your email because it'll be obviously a lot cheaper to do that. If you want a copy, a hard copy of it, we'll probably have to do it on front and back. So it won't be a page devoted to each of the land grants. And that's okay too, but you'll have that for your purposes. So I will have 2 tablets going around after the end of the presentation. And give me some time within a couple of weeks, and we'll get those things to you on email. However, if you want a hard copy, Penny and I will have to talk about this and see how we get them to you, which would include print costs as well as postage.
It's one per family, though.
Yeah, okay, yeah, one per family. So that is some of the preliminary stuff that I wanted to mention to you. If you look at your packet, and another section of the packet is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. After the American occupation of 1846, there was an envoy in Mexico from the United States government, and it included a gentleman whose last name is Trist, T-R-I-S-T. He was the American negotiator with the Mexican representatives. They created the Guadalupe Hidalgo. They wrote it up. And in the meantime, as you read into this, you're going to find that Trist did not have the sanction of the U.S. president, who then was Polk. But Trist went ahead and he, with the Mexican counterparts, created the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. Now, the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, and the reason it's called the Guadalupe Hidalgo is because it was in that village that it was created. I've only printed 3 articles, probably the 3 most important articles of the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty that relates to land ownership. Actually, the recognition of Article 8, which says that the Mexicans, and remember at that point it was Mexican territory, so they called our ancestors, the Americans called our ancestors Mexicans because they were Mexican citizens. Well, Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Article 8, had 2 important points that the people had, that the American government was going to recognize their properties, and number 2, it was going to give them U.S. citizenship. In fact, the U.S. government said to the people in New Mexico, you have 1 year to make up your mind if you want to be a U.S. citizen or if you want to be a Mexican citizen. If you want to be a Mexican citizen, you're going to have to return to Mexico. And at that time, you know that they created the boundary between the U.S., New Mexico, and using the Rio Grande. And there's another story behind that. Article 9 of the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty talks about the citizenship. But probably the most important one is Article 10. And Article 10 says that the land grants that our ancestors had from way back from the 1700s, or in one case 1693 to 1848 were going to be recognized by the US government. Well, even though the individuals, the American counterpart, the Mexican party, agreed on all of these things, it had to go to Congress to be ratified. It went to Congress. Congress omitted Article 9, which gave the ownership, would have recognized the ownership of all of these land grants to our ancestors. They removed it. So as a result, a lot of our ancestors lost what they had had for generations. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's part of the packet. The last piece of that part is called the Protocol of Querétaro. And you will read that, by the way, the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, when was it set? And it says a date on there. It was just last week, February the 2nd of 1848. Then the next piece is the Protocol of Querétaro. And you can take time to check that out. The next section in your packet is a list of bibliography of all of the sources that I used in the research. And there are some very neat sources there. And if you're a collector of books, that will definitely help you. And probably, I'd like to draw your attention to one person in particular, and that's Malcolm E. Bright. Malcolm E. Bright lives in Guadalupe, which is in the Mora Valley area just west of Las Vegas. He has written numerous books about the land grants in New Mexico, and if you really want to get into a specific source, he definitely would be one that you ought to consider. The next item on that, I included websites. So those websites will be available to you if you want to do some research on specific land grants or land grants in general, and you'll find some out of the New Mexico State Historian's Office, and that's located at the archives. And Rick Hendricks is currently the director of he's a state historian, and some of you know his assistant. His name is Robert Martinez. He and his buddy have sang at our conferences in Santa Fe. So you will, so that's some information. You will also find suggested readings and viewing, and then I have internet contact. There's a guy out of Taos. His name is Frank Skid Trujillo, and Frank has a Facebook page on land grants in New Mexico, and so you might want to check his out. The next thing I have is one of the things that I found in my research are these 3 or 4 pages, and in order for me to find out which were the land grants in Taos County, I googled Malcolm E. Bright's website, and it is basically www.southwestbooks.org. So you can look, and because although I'm only going to concentrate on Taos County, if you have family like Penny that came from Atrisco, and you want to know where those land grants are, you can search up at the top for a particular land grant or by county. So this is what drove me to identify the 39 land grants in Taos County. So that information is available to you, and it's also got like a synopsis of the land grants. Now, since you don't have the body of the paper, the next best thing I thought I would give you would be, because we're interested in people and our ancestors, the last part of or second to the last part of the booklet are the land grants. So starting with Arroyo Hondo, I've included the names of the individuals that were involved in that particular land grant. So if you look at the Arroyo Hondo, I have 4 columns: individuals, their position, location, and year. So in Arroyo Hondo, the alcalde, and getting back to, again, terms, and you're going to see this in the glossary, an alcalde was like a mayor type in each alcaldía. And when Spain and the Mexican government established areas in New Mexico, obviously they weren't called counties or condados, but they were called alcaldías. So Taos had his own alcaldía, which was an area, okay? If you kind of think of county and alcaldía, it's almost the same thing. So an alcalde was like a mayor of that particular area. So in terms of positions, the governor was the top, and then there was an alcalde in each one of the communities. So this is the part that I thought would be beneficial to you, and that would be, are there any of my ancestors in a particular county in the Taos County area? So this is what I was able to construct for you, was a list of individuals. So it gives you information about the individuals, their location, and then that particular year when that county was set. So that, in a sense, is what that packet looks like. I wanted to explain that first. And then there is 2 more sections. And I included a page because, you know, some of you, Abel and Virginia, are my part of my kind of generation. We grew up in college in the mid-late 60s, and at that time we were hearing the rebellion that was going down in Tierra Maria with Reyes Lopez Tijerina and the Tierra Maria land grant. So I have some questions here. What went wrong with the land grant claimants? And then the purposes between the Court of Private Land Claims and the purpose of the U.S. Attorney. And I found that information in a couple of my Alchemy Bright books. And as we go through the PowerPoint, I'm going to focus in also on a map that is located in the back of your booklet. So let's just go, let's just start, and then, also included in your packet, although the Cornells land grant was not part of the Taos County, because, you know, when Colorado became a territory in 1860, I can't remember the exact date, the Surveyor General's office from New Mexico released the Cornells land grant to the Surveyor General's office in Denver out of Colorado. But I thought, you know, I'm going to put a little bit of information together on the Cornells land grant because we have some ancestors in our group here that were from the Cornells, Antonito area, Las Sauces area, the whole area. So that's probably the last page you will find, and it's not stapled onto your packet because that was something that I put together just this last week. So without ado, let me begin with this. The information on the land grant history in New Mexico is extensive. You know, it is as extensive as there is research. There's volumes. You could spend probably a year looking at the microfilms that were digitized of all the land grants in New Mexico. It is interesting. And the purpose of the land grants, when the Spanish were in charge up through 1821, the purpose of the land grant was to provide settlers to a particular area. They were also supposed to be buffers for the attacks that the Spanish were getting from all the different native tribes. From the west, if you think of Santa Fe or that area, the west, what you had were the Navajo, the Utes in the mountains. On the east of the plains, if you think of the Sandia Mountains in Albuquerque, in the Llano Estacado, which was the plains of the Texas area, you had the Comanche, you had the Kiowa. And up north, like east of Raton, the Jicari Apaches were also involved in that. So we needed to have, or the Spanish government needed to have, were buffer zones. And people were already populating, so they were running out of property, like I mentioned to you, in the Chama area. So they were looking for rivers, and they were looking for vegas. Vegas is a Spanish word for a meadow, for grazing and also for sustaining their livelihood. Now, the other thing, like I said, I wanted to do, and I hope it helps some of you out, is there a connection between some of these grantees or settlers with your family tree? Okay, Bill? I'd like for you to think about these things as I talk today and try to answer your questions, and maybe as you do your own research. Why and where were land grants issued by the Spanish governor? And this, it all started in Santa Fe, right? But Santa Fe was not the seat, but rather San Juan area was the seat, and the Rio Chama area. And then in 1610, when they made Santa Fe the capital, people were looking for, again, water and places to grow crops. And, okay, the settlers that we have, and we have families. I became interested in this because I'm from Costa. Well, I was born in Costilla. My dad was born in Costilla. His father was born in Costilla. His father was born in Arroyo Hondo. My dad used to say that the Sangre de Cristal land grant, in Spanish I remember him saying, it was a merced, M-E-R-C-E-D, right? And a merced, the Spanish word for land grant. And Dad would tell me que la merced era de la gente. It was a people's property. And you'll find out later that the Sangre de Cristal was not issued to the people. It was only issued to 2 individuals. And I'll talk a little bit about that history if we have time. And the last one, do you know where to locate information on the land grants? And that hopefully will be answered as you look at the packet and find all the different resources that I was able to use. And not to say that those are the only sources. No, those are the ones that I selected to help me put this project together. Okay, Bill? Okay. The pre-revolt period, right? Oñate came in 1598 with his troops and conquered the people of Okeowengue, which is now the San Juan Pueblo. All right, and from 1598 to 1680, the Spanish population was pretty much concentrated in the San Juan area, the Rio Grande area. When you look at some of the literature, you're going to see the Spanish word encomiendas. An encomienda is a tribute. So Oñate did the same thing that his predecessors did in Mexico, that his predecessors did in Spain. When the Moors were driven out of Spain in 1492 by the Spanish soldiers of Isabella and Ferdinand, in order to reward their soldiers, the king and queen gave these people some property. Now, this property, if it had people living in them, those people were like the indentured slaves of the soldier that came in. In New Mexico, and Central and South America, the Spanish, that was their custom. That's what they lived. That's what their ancestors lived. So in New Mexico, Oñate, there are 23 pueblos. He gave out 60 encomiendas, and some of these soldiers shared a pueblo. Now, so the individual was an encomendero, and you're going to see that word as you look at your research. Now, the Pueblo Indians were indentured slaves of the Spanish, and there were twice a year that these people had to pay tribute to the Spaniard. In May, and then again in October. In May, they were supposed to provide the Spanish with hides, dressed hides, and cotton or any kind of material that they created. In the fall, they were supposed to give them grain, vegetables, produce, and all of those things. So that pattern of life went on for 82 years. The other group of people that were responsible for the revolt were the Franciscans. The Franciscans, okay, they came in to convert the Indians, to make them Catholic. And they built missions, right? But the Franciscans didn't do that. The Spanish didn't do that. The Indians were their indentured slaves. So the Indians built the missions, and so the Indians also gave tribute to the Franciscans. There are stories that go on in research that the Franciscans had more grain in their conventos. Usually a missionary would design the church, and right next to the church would be a convento. A convento is mostly a dwelling for the priest, but he also had storage rooms in there. There are stories that some of the conventos were filled with piñón, or they were filled with corn, or they were filled with various kinds of vegetables. So then the Indians, they got fed up with all of this after 82 years, and then they started the revolt in 1680. And so the Spanish were gone for 12 years. Those that survived the revolt went back to El Paso. El Paso del Norte is what it was called. And if you look at church records, it was called Our Lady, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe del Norte. And you were going to find, when de Vargas came back with the Spaniards, he knew what created this revolt in 1680. He said then, we're going to change some things. So, number one, there could no longer be any encomiendas. In other words, you cannot make a native, whether it was a Pueblo Indian or a Plains Indian, a slave. If you're going to make them do work, you've got to pay them. And there were some rules about what they had to do in order to pay the Indians. So, no encomiendas anymore. Secondly, he brought back, because he was a Spaniard, he brought back to the New World and to New Mexico standards of measurement. So in your package, you're going to find that a lot of these land grants are measured not in feet, right? Because we're talking about 1692, but they were measured in varas. And a vara is about 30 inches long, little less than a yard. So you will find in some of the research, if you look up at your ancestors, that they were given 100 varas or 200 varas of land, or maybe 500 varas. The other thing that you will find is a league. And a league, and you'll find in your packet, and I can't remember right now, I apologize, for how many varas there are in a league. Okay, land grants. In one of the last pages that you're going to find that has the map of New Mexico with all of the land grants, there were 295 land grants made from 1692 to 1846. Remember, 1846 is a line where it became American occupation. 141 of the land grants were private land grants. In other words, I would apply to the governor for a land grant, and we would measure it out. We would walk it, is actually what we would do, and we would kind of come up with an estimate of how much property there was and what the north boundary was, the east boundary, the south boundary, and the west boundary. 154 were community land grants, and you're going to see that in my work, that I will call them either Hispano private land grant or a Hispano community land grant or Hispano quasi community land grant. In fact, that's what the Sangre de Cristo was a Hispano quasi-community land grant. Of all these, there were 23 Pueblo grants for the Pueblo Indians, and they were made by Governor Cruzate. That's the reason that I have Cruzate in parentheses. Now, what I don't know is that these land grants, the Pueblo land grants, were issued in 1689. But you got to remember the time frame that the Spanish were out of New Mexico between 1680 and 1692. So was it that when he was in El Paso that he created this opportunity? Now, what's interesting about the Pueblo land grants, and I hope I don't forget about this point, when the Spanish Franciscans came into each of the pueblos in the pre-revolt time frame, they put a cross in the middle of the pueblo. So Cruzate then said, every pueblo is eligible for 4 square leagues. In fact, Malcolm E. Bright has a book that's called 4 Square Leagues. So from the center of the Pueblo, if you walk out 1 league to the north, 1 league to the east, 1 league to the south, 1 league to the west, and in your map, and hopefully if we have time we'll go through that, you're going to see that there's 23 land grants that are absolutely square. Okay, I think we're going to pass this up because I kind of just mentioned a little bit the Guadalupe Hidalgo treaty as well as a protocol. I think the thing that disturbs most of us mostly today in 2017, or if we go back to 1966 when Reyes Lopez Tijerina was executing a point that was very critical. And you know, he was not a Mexican by birth. He was from Texas. But he saw an injustice. And it's really interesting to read the journals, his journals, about the takeover in the Tierra Amarilla land grant. In fact, there's a really good book out called Juan Bautista, the Land Grant, because a writer talks about what Reyes Lopez Tijerina did during the 1960s. Let's go ahead, Bill. And this talks mostly about the Protocol of Querétaro. And my computer doesn't have accent marks, so you're not going to see the accents on some of these words. But I don't want to read for you because you can do that, but that's available in your packet. Bill? Okay, after the American occupation of 1846, and then with the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848, and Congress rejected Article 10, they came up with some rules about how are we, the American government, going to recognize land ownership or land grant ownership. So they created an office called the Surveyor General. And so in 1854, the Surveyor General was an individual who had assistants who went out and put out publications to all of the people in New Mexico. If you want your land grant to be recognized by the U.S. government, these are the procedures that you need to follow. And one of the things they had to do was that they had to provide paperwork. Now you got to remember the differences in cultures, right? The American government and the Spanish government and customs. And if I can go back just a little bit, there was a routine that the governor, every governor since de Vargas, all the way up to the last Mexican governor in 1841, Manuel Armijo, had a procedure that was established by the Spanish. So me, as an individual who wanted a land grant, whether it was an individual or a community, I would apply in writing to the governor. Now, if I didn't know how to write, I went to the alcalde. Alcalde knew how to write, and so he described the area, where it was and how long and those sorts of things. He would then take the paperwork to the governor. The governor would send back to the alcalde, all right, research this thing out. Make sure it doesn't infringe on anybody's property rights. So the alcalde said everything's cool. So he would then go back to the governor. The governor then would say, okay, so he would sign a declaration that John Valdez or Juan Valdez was the owner now of the land grant. So the alcalde and I, along with my neighbors of that area, would go to the land grant. And the alcalde would ask the neighbors, do you have any problems with this land grant and the property lines that we have created? And if everybody said, no, we're okay, then he would proceed to the next ceremony. And this happened at every one of the land grants. So the alcalde and the new owner would take some grass or dirt, throw it up in the air, and say, que viva el rey de España. This was during the Spanish period. During the Mexican period, they would throw that same stuff up in the air, que viva la nación mexicana y el presidente de la nación. So there were 3 little rituals that the alcalde and the new owner would do. Besides throwing the dirt up in the air, they would throw stones also in 4 different directions. And if there was water, now the thing about water, and I'll mention this again, and I did last time. In Spanish customs and history, no one person could own a creek or river, okay? Your property went up to the bank. On the other side, somebody else owned that property. That water was available to everybody. Not like in America, you know, that the Americans brought in after 1848. So the Spanish knew how important water was and how precious it was, and it had to benefit everybody in that area. So that was a little bit of a ceremony that the alcalde, the new grantee or grantees would do. But as I was making reference, so the Surveyor General said to everybody, now this is 1854. You know, how many years have passed since 1692? What had happened to a lot of the paperwork that some of the early grantees had, it got destroyed over time. However, some of them, it did continue. So those people who are fortunate enough to treasure that paperwork, the Surveyor General approved every one of those land grants. But our ancestors who lost that paperwork or was destroyed or whatever happened to it, they were not. So they were basically out of land after how many generations, or at least 150 years. Yes, Carmen?
Did you find any information on the Santa Fe Ring, which I understand was an organized attorneys and a bunch of people that just ripped off the land grants?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did, Carmen, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit later because I think I have a slide about that, all right? But to make a point, and most of you know that I go to Albuquerque and Santa Fe a lot, and I was at the archives one day, and when you walk into the archives, in the genealogy section, they have a table of new books that have just been released. And about 2 years ago, I saw a book that was just, the title was just fascinating, and it's in your bibliography. It's called Chasing the Santa Fe Ring, and it's a new book that was just published in 2014. So it's not a revisionist, but it's got new information out, so you can look at that too. And by the way, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, as I was going through our index of what we had, we have a book in our boxes back here that's called Thomas Benton Catron. He was a primary culprit of the Santa Fe Ring. And if you get a chance to check it out and read it, it's a good read. But the author, who is a professor, I think, at Arizona University, I think doctored a lot of this stuff, because I think he got permission from the Catron descendants about what he could publish. So it's skewed in various ways. Okay, Bill. Oh, back up. The Court of Private Land Claims is another source that you're going to be aware of. So the Surveyor General was in place from 1694 to 1891. As he was submitting stuff to the Congress for their approval and verifying, not verifying, but approving the land grants, they became so backlogged, so they stopped approving. So then they created a Court of Private Land Claims, which is a tribunal. And these were all former lawyers or judges from the East, from the Midwest, and they come to New Mexico, don't understand culture, don't understand history, don't understand customs, the language. And so here they are in charge of trying to make a determination of who owns that property. Okay. Okay. This slide talks about the different difficulties that our ancestors, or I call claimants, had as they were trying to validate and confirm their land grants under the community, under the rules by the American occupation. And I believe this slide is also available in your packet. But I would like to draw your attention to this last point. When back to the Spanish, to de Vargas and all the other governors following that, knew that for both an individual land grant and especially a community land grant, they had to have an ejido. An ejido is a Spanish word to describe community lands. And these community lands were usually mountainous. And this is where everybody in that land grant was allowed to graze their livestock. Okay, so when decisions were being made by the Court of Private Land Claims, they said, we don't understand that, we don't agree with that, we will just give you the land itself where you live. The ejido. So in New Mexico, and I can't remember now the millions of acres that the Forest Service owns. Guess where those things belong?
National parks.
Well, they belong to families. But the government said they are government properties, and therefore they eventually became national forests.
Yeah.
Okay? So, well, we can get into it. Go ahead, Bill.
That was woodland too, by the way.
Yes.
Whoop.
And these are some more issues that our claimants had. Okay, so one of the issues was, like Carmen brought up, are dishonest attorneys. So our ancestors, now we're talking about 1850s, 1890s, early 1900s. Our people did not go to school. There was no public education, and there again may not be another public education, but that's a thought for another place and time, right? I'm sorry, I'm an educator, I'll always be, I'm a union man, I'll always be. So, the two main guys of the Santa Fe Ring were Thomas Benton Catron, C-A-T-R-O-N, and Stephen Elkins. These two guys were from Missouri. And they were not in the Civil War. Now we're talking about 1860s or so, okay? They were not in the Civil War, but they had just graduated from law school in Missouri. So everybody was advertising lands in New Mexico. So these two guys, they come to Las Cruces. They eventually ended up in Santa Fe, created their own firm in Santa Fe. And our people did not have adequate representation with the Surveyor General and eventually with the Court of Private Land Claims. So they needed a lawyer, right? Somebody to represent them in these issues. So the only lawyers around were in Santa Fe, and they were part of this group. And so our people did not have money, right? Everything was dealt by a barter system. You know, who had pesos? Who had dollars? You know, nobody did. So the trade-off was what? Land. So these guys, and Elkins left New Mexico sometime in the 1870s, and he became a big wheel in D.C. with other presidential governments. Catron stayed. At one point, and for lack of a better word, and I appreciate my elders here, but you know, they got screwed out of property. Sure. And Catron, after the Tierra Maria land grant, and he was able to acquire all the ejidos. And when you look at the map on the Tierra Maria land grant, it is huge. Anyway, sometime in the 1870s, he was the largest landowner in America. And you can read that in that book, or you can read it in the book that I mentioned, Chasing the Santa Fe Ring. Okay, land speculators were also those same lawyers. And what were they trying to do? They were trying to sell this land to the people in the East. And that happened. That happened in the Sangre de Cristo land grant. And I'll go back to that a little later. In the 1880s, early 1880s, there was a big scandal with the Maxwell land grant. And the Maxwell land grant, if you look going down I-25, when you cross the Colorado border into New Mexico, everything from Raton to Las Vegas, and I don't know how many miles east is a Maxwell land grant. So there were other speculators that came in, and there were range wars. There was a Methodist minister in Cimarron, New Mexico, that knew that the Hispanic people that lived in the Cimarron area, that was their land. Well, he stuck up for them, and there was all kinds of shooting going on. He got killed. His wife communicated with the president at that time and was able to put this out in the East Coast and make it public about what was going on in New Mexico. So that's why I have that in there, and you can read more about that. Okay, Bill? All right, so this is the beginning of the packet of land grants. And like I said, I did not put them in chronological order. I put them in alphabetical order. And your sheet is going to look a little differently than this. But the Arroyo land grant, Penny, how much time do I have?
Well, you got a good half hour.
Okay, it was issued in 1815. The grantee was Felipe Nerio Cisneros. And this is one of the reasons that I got interested in this. And the other one I have to give credit to, where is George? Right there. George, as you know, one of his ancestors is Charles Otterby. When I read George's book, was it last year or the year before? He had a section in there about the Cebolla land grant, and it's going to pop up in a little bit. Well, in his book, he says that the grantees of the Cebolla land grant was Julian Santisteban and Charles Otterby and Tom Tobin. So I did a little bit of work. Julian Santisteban is my great-great-grandfather, and from Costilla. So that kind of really got me into it. And so then I come around, and when I do my research, and I see Felipe Nerio Cisneros, and my grandma was a Barella and a Trujillo, but through marriage about 3 generations ago, he came from the Abiquiu area. Like I told you before, a lot of people from Abiquiu, Chama area ended up in Taos and then to Arroyo Hondo. He brought several other individuals and established the Arroyo Hondo land grant. Okay, Bill, the next one. Now this one is called La Cañada de los Mestaños, and this is also just a little bit north of Arroyo Hondo. And in your packet, you're going to find, who were some of the individuals in this. Okay, Bill? This is La Cañada del Río Colorado, and it was issued in 1836. And if I have on a slide that it was issued by somebody other than a governor, guess what happened during the American occupation when they were trying to resolve issues? Well, the one, I don't know if it was good or bad thing. I was going to say good thing that the Americans did is they followed Spanish and Mexican rules. Okay? And you got to have a base. Okay, well, the Spanish rule was that only governors could issue grants. But the alcalde was the vehicle that did all of this. This started everything going. But if an alcalde, and you're going to see in some, an alcalde or a prefect who is kind of like an alcalde issued land grants, the American courts turned it down and said, you're not eligible for that. There was another rule that when a land grant was issued, the governor said to the individual or individuals, you have X number of years to settle it. Okay? So most of the time it was 2 years or it was 4 years. And in some of the cases, and you're going to see up here, especially the Ojo Caliente and also the Cornells land grant, people tried to settle it. They were driven back by Indians, especially the Cornells land grant. The settlers were driven back to Costilla or to Arroyo Hondo or to Taos or back to Chama because of the attacks by the Navajo. Bob's ancestor, and I think it's a 3 great-grandfather, Atanasio Trujillo, was one of the leaders of the Cornells land grant. And he was a hunter. And most of the people from the Chama area would travel north up the mountains and get, livestock or get their meat and then come. Well, he saw that area where the Chama River is, and I shouldn't talk about this because it'll come up in a little later. But he saw that area and he said this was a good place to settle and start families. Okay. So the reason I point this out, because Antonio Jose Ortiz was the alcalde de Taos. And we will find later if he was the one that issued it or he was the vehicle that the governor said, go ahead and do it. Okay, next one. Now, this is the Cañón del Río Colorado land grant. There are 2 land grants in Questa, and which we know as Questa, right? And as I said earlier, it was called San Antonio del Río Colorado, San Antonio of the Red River. Well, the Cañón del Río Colorado, as you climb up Questa and as you're going south towards Arroyo Hondo, that ridge on top is called El Cañón. But the area down here where the Red River flows through, where Questa is right now, that's San Antonio del Río Colorado. So the grantees were Antonio Elias Armenta, Jose Victor Sanchez, Jose Manuel Sanchez. And there were 2 attempts to settle it, and they did not. So it was not validated. Go ahead, Bill. This is the one that is Questa proper right now, the San Antonio del Río Colorado land grant. And I didn't know that it was a land grant until 2 things. One, I saw it on that listing that I saw from Malcolm Ebright. And if you go to the office of the State Historian of New Mexico and you type in what I have on the website, it'll take you straight to this. There are 2 ladies that wrote an interesting story about Questa and its history that I never knew about. So, there's information. Thank goodness for the internet, Some people say it's not true or half-truths, but it certainly gives you a lead. Okay, Bill. This is the grant that I was telling you about earlier that George has in his book, the Savoya Land Grant. And the Savoya Land Grant, as we're going south from Questa and we're rising up the hills, it's called La Lama now, and that's where the Savoya Land Grant was. And it was issued, as you can see, in 1845 by Governor Manuel Armijos to Carlos Santisteban and Julian Santisteban. Carlos is the son of Julian, and Carlos Ortiviz and Tomas Ortiviz. And we know who Ortivizes are, right? The Ortiviz. But Tomas is, what's his last name? Tobin, right? They're half brothers. But the priest, Father Martinez, would write Ortiviz. There was nothing that was comparable to Ortivi, so he gave them the name Ortiviz. Now, what's interesting, on a side note, we have some Ortivizes here in Pueblo, right? Yeah. And there was one guy, I think he was a journalist for Channel 5 News or something, and I kept thinking, I wonder if he's an Ortivi. Well, that's another story for another day.
There's Otterbees in Avondale.
Yeah, well, the Otterbees in Avondale are who he's connected with.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. The next one, this is an interesting one. La Cieneguilla Land Grant. Cieneguilla, or Cienega, is swamp in Spanish, okay? So wherever there was a watery area, sometimes a river jumps the banks, and creates that. How many of you been to Taos and going south through the Cañón towards Española, and as you drop the canyon, you get into Pilar?
Yes.
That's what Cieneguilla was. And as I researched, I said, wow, this is interesting. It's just fascinating. But anyway, it's one of the older land grants, 1795 by Governor Fernando Chacon. And these are some of the grantees. The grant was 43,900 acres. And as I said, it's in Pilar now. That grant ran into some problems during the confirmation process. Go ahead, Bill. This one is the oldest in Taos. This is the Cristal de la Serna land grant. And it was issued in 1710 to Cristal de la Serna by Governor José Chacón Medina Salazar y Villaseñor. The owner was Cristóbal de la Serna. It was a quasi-community grant of 30,000 acres. It is now where Ranchos de Taos is. So if you picture 1700s, the only people living up there are the Taos Pueblo Indians. Okay? That's all that's there. So Cristobal wanted to bring some people from the Santa Cruz area. So he saw the river, El Río Fernando de Taos, that comes through there, and he applied for that land grant to the governor. He got the land grant, but he didn't settle it. Do you know anything about Cristobal de la Serna? Okay, interesting. And some of you have been to the governor's Palace Museum, right? And in the governor's museum, they still have the Sagesser hides. Have you seen the Sagesser hides? The Sagesser hides are on display and have been for a long time at the museum. They depict the battle between the Spanish and their native compatriots, which are Pueblo Indians and some Apaches. The governor had heard that there was French intrusion in the eastern and northeastern part of what was then part of Spanish boundaries. So he sent Villasur, his lieutenant governor, and an army of 40 Spanish and about 90 Native Americans to find out. So they came up, they came up to Taos, crossed the mountains, came up north, followed the Arkansas River east, then went north to where Nebraska is now. They found an encampment of Pawnee Indians and Oto Indians up there, and they got into a little battle. And were the French there? Well, the Pawnee and the other tribes had muskets that only the French had. So the French were already doing this stuff, and Spain and France were at war with each other. Well, anyway, they killed over 30 of the Spanish and about 30 of the Native Americans. Cristobal de la Serna was an officer in that group, and he got killed. So it is about where Columbus, Nebraska is now. That's where the battle took place. So anyway, he never got to settle the land grant, and it has some other history that goes with it. Okay. Yeah. The Jose Dominguez land grant, and this is another one, and you're going to find it in your map. So let's go through with it. Okay, that's right. Now this is the Don Fernando de Taos. As you can see, it was issued in 1796. So ranchos is already set up, but there were other people that wanted property. Whether it's the same grantees or settlers, we don't know. And where Taos proper is right now, that's part of the Don Fernando land grant. And as you can see, the initial grantee was Jose Montoya and 63 other families. And this is where the city of Taos is. Okay? The Ambu land grant. This is another one that's really quite interesting. And this was issued in 1725 by Governor Bustamante. Now, most of the people that lived in that area were all Martin Serranos. And you're going to find those names as you go through those lists that are there. And it is where Dixon is today. And you know why Dixon is named Dixon? Do you know why Cleveland, New Mexico is named Cleveland? Cleveland was Agua Negra. Dixon was Embudo. Well, when the Americans came in, and started the postal system, they were hiring Anglos to become postmasters. And so that postmaster gave that community his last name. Okay. Hijosa land grant. This is an interesting one. I never knew of it. This is, I don't know any others. This is the first land grant issued to a woman. Her name was Francisca Antonia de Hijosa. And if you look at Taos, and if you're coming north from the canyon, before you get to Ranchos, that area to the west, as it kind of goes towards the gorge, that was her. And it was a good size. It was 20,000 acres. Go ahead, Bill. Plaza de la Guadalupe. This grant never made it because, as you can see, the person who issued it was George Levy, and he was perfect, and it was 39,000 acres. So that never got validated. Las Trampas land grant. And by the way, one of our genealogy friends, Gerald Arguello from Denver, he's going to do a presentation to the Carrata Society Hispanic Genealogy Group in Denver on the Trampas land grant. His family goes back to the first Arguellos who came into the Trampas and were issued that land grant. As I mentioned in the last presentation, the Governor Tomás Velez Cachupin, he needed buffers. So the first land grant he gave to Genízaros was the Las Trampas land grant. And Las Trampas is just east of Chimayo, going up the mountains, okay? But it is one of the first one, well, the first one given to Genízaros. Okay, the next one is Los Luceros land grant. And the reason it's called Los Luceros is because a river that flows out of the mountains just north of Taos is called Luceros. But the reason it's called Antoine Leroux was because he married into the Vigil family. And people then named it the Antoine Leroux land grant.
How did that connect? How did the Vigils connect with Antoine Leroux?
Back up, Bill. Okay, so no. Go forward to Antoine Leroux.
Forward.
Yeah. Okay, as you can see, in 1742, the governor awarded the land grant to Pedro Vigil de Santillan, Juan Bautista, and Cristobal Vigil. These were the Vigils that initially got the land grant. And then about 2 generations later, I believe, or one, Antoine Leroux, a mountain man, right, from French Canada, married a Vigil girl. Then he, I'll leave that the rest to you. This is a huge land grant, 126,000 acres. And okay, next one is the Lorenzo Lovato land grant. And this was a private land grant just to the family of 2,500 acres. And that is located just a little bit north of Picuris Pueblo. As you're going to the top of the hill and you have Trampas, you go down towards Picuris. And then at Picuris, you can either go left to Ambu or you go right to Peñasco. That is in that general area. Lucero de Godoy. Vera, you asked me that on Wednesday. Now, the Lucero de Godoy land grant is an old one too. As you can see, it was issued in 1716 by Governor Feliz Martinez to Antonio Martinez, and it was a quasi-community land grant. Where is that land grant? And that is located north of Taos Pueblo and a little bit west. So you're going to see it in your map, and hopefully we can go over that at the end. Go ahead, Bill. The Sebastian Martin land grant. This is one, and I can't remember. He is like a 3 great-grandson of the first Hernan Martin Serrano, you know, who came in with Oñate in 1598. But this is in the area around Trampas, just west of Trampas. In fact, he gave some of his property to the people that wanted to settle in Budo without any dispute. He knew people were needing more property, so he helped out his compadres, you know, and gave him some property. Yes. Okay. Now, the Maxwell land grant. The Maxwell land grant was initially called the Beaubien Miranda land grant. And the 2 grantees were Charles Beaubien, the French-Canadian, and Guadalupe Miranda. Guadalupe Miranda was Mexican, in the sense that he was born in Mexico, what we now know as Mexico, but he was Governor Manuel Armijo's Secretary of State, so to speak. So the 2 of them applied for this land grant. And this is during the administration of Governor Manuel Armijo. And he gave some of the largest land grants ever. The Spanish had rules. If you were an individual and applied for an individual land grant, you cannot get one for more than 48,000 acres. Up to 48,000. If it was a community land grant, you can only go up to 96,000 acre. The Maxwell land grant turned out to be 1.7, as you can see, million acres. And during the first phase of validating the land grants by a Surveyor General, 1854, this was the first land grant to get validated at its full size. Now, the way it came about to be Maxwell. So, in 1847, okay, American occupation took place in 1846, right, in the fall. So, January of 1847, we know what was called the what? The Taos Revolt, okay? So, in the Taos Revolt, 2 people got killed that were important in the history of this, and they were the 2 grantees of the Sangre de Cristal land grant. Stephen Lewis Lee, who was the sheriff of Taos, and Narciso Beaubien, who was the 13-year-old son of Charles. Charles put up, before they were, when they were still alive, applied through Stephen Lewis Lee and his son to make them grantees of the Sangre de Cristal land grant. So during the revolt, okay, or after the revolt, those 2 people got killed. So Beaubien could not be an owner of 2 land grants. So he sold it for pennies to his son-in-law, Lucien Maxwell. And some of you have connections to Lucien Maxwell from the Mora area. Okay, so he took it over in 1847, and that's why it became the Maxwell land grant. And just to note that it was verified at its full size. Okay. Okay, the Mora land grant. Now this is a big land grant because some of our people come from the Mora area. So this is interesting in itself. It is huge, 827,000 acres, but it was an attempt to create 3 plazas, okay, and with all the people that came in. And you'll read more of that. Go ahead, Bill. The Ojo Caliente land grant, like I said, in 1793 by Governor Fernando de la Concha, and he awarded it to Antonio Jose Espinosa and 52 other individuals. It was huge, 92,000 acres. It was first issued in 1730, okay, to some Martin Serranos. They could not settle it because of the attacks. So when a land grant was not settled, after a prescribed period of time, if the governor said you got to be there by 4 years, and if you're not, it comes up again for me to issue it. And so that's what it continued. So some of your ancestors who were in the Chama area and ended up in the Tierra Maria or in the Conejos area came from this area. This one, I could not find a location, but those of you who are familiar with Costilla, in Costilla, and as you're going south on in Mexico 522, against the mountains, there's a ranch, and it's called, my dad used to call it Luraca, and to me it didn't make any sense as a kid growing up. But now there is a ranch there, it's called Uraca, and Uraca is a Spanish word for magpie. So I think that's probably where this land grant was, but I have not found more information on that. Okay, Bill. The Petaca land grant is another critical one when you start looking at the land claimants and the issues that it happened. It is west of the Ojo Caliente. It was a large land grant of 186,000. When it came to the courts to validate it, the judges, the tribunal, left out all the ejidos. It came out only to be like 10,000 acres. So the people were, well, they didn't have access to the community, to the ejido.
I hate to ask you a question now, but did you ever connect that Antonio Martinez to the Antonio Martinez for the Los Lucero grant?
No, I've not been able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. The Picuris Pueblo, right, in Taos County, which is just above Chimayo. Okay. It was issued in, as I said, all the pueblos were issued in 1689 by Governor Cruzate. And it's 4 square leagues. If you haven't driven by, it's a pretty area. If you ever going to Santa Fe or Española from Taos, that's called the high road. It takes you to Ranchos and Talpa, and then up, and you pass Peñasco, and then at Picuris you can either go straight to Embudo and to the canyon, or you can go left and it takes you up to Trampas. And some of your ancestors came from the Trampas area. That mission church up there has been around since well, you know, it was established in 1751, so that gives you an idea. Okay, Bill. El Rancho del Rio Grande land grant is also just east of the Picuris Pueblo. As you can see, it's a big one. It's 109,000 acres.
We've got about 5 more minutes.
Okay, well, let's go, Bill. Okay, this is another one in the Questa area. Go ahead, Bill. The San Cristobal also is the village of San Cristobal in Taos County. Are you familiar with it? Between Arroyo Hondo and Questa, the road that takes you to the mountains, up in that area? Yeah. Okay. In one of your last pages in your packet, I was able to find a map of New Mexico with all 295 land grants. And so what I did here is just copied the northern part, and as you can see, the second page following this page are the names of every one of the land grants in New Mexico, and they are in chronological order. So you can see that. So if you look at, sorry, I forgot my pointer. So see this land grant, a number 1, a number 2, number 3, a number 4. What do you think they are? From what I told you. They're all square, aren't they? So those are some of the Pueblo land grants. Number 1 is Picuris. And this one, I believe, is Taos Pueblo. But if you look at this, when you get a chance to look at this, these are some of the land grants in the Taos County area. This is the Maxwell. This is the Sangre de Cristo. This is the Tierra Maria. And Conejos, of course, is up in this area. And you'll be able to follow all of these, and Santa Fe is probably somewhere in this area in through here. So that's a map that I thought would really help you out. Bill, you want to go to the next slide?
Yep.
This is a listing of all of those land grants. And what I started to do at first was to highlight in yellow those that were in the Taos County area. But it'll give you the name of the grant. Well, first of all, the map number, you know, the number of the land grant, the grant name, when it was granted, and then the acreage. Now, by granted, it means when the governor granted it, not when the U.S. government validated it. Okay, Bill? This is the sheet I was telling you about earlier, and I think this is really purposeful. And you can check the website, and you can find the particulars on each of the land grant, the name of the land grant, the source, whether you find it. SG stands for Surveyor General, the microfilm. The PLC is a Court of Private Land Claims. Bowden is the gentleman who I said did his master's degree and summarized the land grant. Who the grantee was, the date it was issued, the type of grant, the grantor, in other words, a governor, or if it was an alcalde, the county, how many acres were claimed, how many acres were confirmed. As you can see, there'll be a big discrepancy in that. Here's one that's 0. Yeah. Go ahead, Bill. Well, just keep going because these are all in alpha order.
John,
Yes, ma'am.
I know this is on Taos, but do you know the name of the land grants that were in Pecos?
Yeah, if you go to your map, the one that preceded this, you're going to look at that, and then you're going to be able to identify it in the map, and then you can refer to the legend and the name of it. Yeah, we'll look at this. Okay, and here's the website. If you're interested, it's on the very last page. Bill? Okay. Something else I found in a book that was written by R.L. Nostrand called Hispano Homeland. And his book is not very old. I think it's a 2008 or 09 book. But it's expansion and the migration patterns, as you can see, where people... Guadalupita here is in the Mora area. See, here's Mora. What he believes is some of the families from that area that went this way. Well, if you go this way, what are some of the communities in through here? Raton, up by the right. If you go this way, yeah. And through Wagon Mountain's in through here, and then on this side of the mountain range where Taos is, and as he can see, in some of our relatives went from Taos to San Cristobal, Arroyo Hondo, Questa, Costilla, and some went up to San Luis, San Pablo, and then crossed the mountains, and then came either to Pueblo or to the Gardner area. And you can look at these other lines in the migration pattern. And I think that's it, right, Bill? Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you.